So the heart of the gospel is God's heart and his motive of why he gave his son's life for you. And what we're going to go into today is this is a very important letter. It's a letter written by the Apostle Paul to his son in the faith, Timothy. Paul, as you look at the end of the book of Acts, Paul is imprisoned in Rome. But Paul goes through two imprisonments. That first imprisonment was for a year or several years, and he was basically in a rented house. He was under house arrest, essentially. And he could have visitors, he could have people come and go. He had basically had a house church going on in there. And it was really a center of Paul's ministry spreading around the world. And then at some point he was released. There are different theories of where he went because it's not in the scriptures. But one of the men that he led to the Lord, one of the men that was under him, because what Paul was doing was Paul was training the next generation of leaders. And that's so important. We'll talk about that in a minute. Paul was training the next generation of leaders, and the principal among them was Timothy. Timothy was a man, in fact, Tony Cook, who's been here a number of times, has a book, In Search of Timothys, because Timothy was a man that was submitted under Paul's ministry, was a disciple of Paul, but he was the one Paul could trust in more than anyone else. Paul had others. He had Apollos, who was a great teacher, but Apollos wasn't there always when Paul needed him. But Timothy was always there. So Paul entrusted him. So Paul now, in this letter is written, is in his second imprisonment. In this imprisonment, he's imprisoned by Nero, who was the emperor, the fifth emperor of Rome. Nero is the one that the joke is he fiddled while Rome burned. I don't want to go into all of that right now, but he started out really as a decent emperor, and then he married the wrong woman. And we won't go there this morning. And things went downhill fast, and he ended up having failures in his, wanting to do things personally, he wanted to build a huge palace for himself, and in order to raise the money for that, he decided to burn Rome. It doesn't make sense, but that's what he did. And then what he did is he blamed Christians for setting Rome on fire. And so that began one of the worst waves of persecution against the church. And in the process, Paul is arrested. And he's thrown in a prison this time. This is a prison that's still there today. Tony Cook, when he was here, I think last time, brought us pictures. It's a hole in the ground. It's a stone hole in the ground, and Paul is in there. He can have no visitors. It's dark, but what he is allowed to do is write. And the last record we have of what Paul did is he wrote this letter to this precious son in the faith, Timothy. Now, Timothy, as you look in 1 Timothy, had been left in Ephesus. Although Paul did not start that church, there was a series of churches coming out of Ephesus. And Paul left Timothy there to organize it and to put things in order there, just as he sent Titus to Crete to put things in order. So Paul is preparing for the next generation. And Timothy is most likely there when this letter is written to him and received by him. So this is very important because this is not a letter like so many of Paul's letters that has doctrine in it. This is not a letter that it talks about doctrine, but it doesn't contain doctrine. It doesn't contain correction like so many of his letters does. It literally is last instructions to his son in the faith as his last communication before Paul leaves this flesh and goes to be with the Lord, and the torch is now handed over to Timothy to pick up what Paul had started and to leave it. And the time that this is in are worse times than when Paul started his ministry. The title of this is Paul's final words to Timothy, or final instructions to the church. And they're appropriate for us today. But we're going to just take today, I believe, because there are things I want to get into next week. And so all I'm doing is pulling out really three key things that I believe Paul is telling the church here. Since Paul is not going to be there, Paul was a rock, he was an anchor, and he was not going to be there anymore. And the church was facing difficult times. In fact, if you go to Acts chapter 20, you'll see the last meeting Paul has with the elders at Ephesus. He's on his way to Rome, or on his way, I don't remember which one. He's on his way. And he meets out on the beach and meets with them. I think he's on his way back to Jerusalem. He meets with them because he's going to be arrested and taken to Rome. He meets with the elders and basically says, you're not going to see my face again. And he says, and what's going to happen is wolves are going to come into the church. And he's not talking about four-legged wolves. He's talking about two-legged wolves. People are going to come into the church to try to destroy it and pull it off track. Well, now we're years later, and that's happening. So Paul is writing to Timothy about three major dangers that are coming upon the church, and these are the same dangers that come against the church today, which is why I believe it's worth looking at his instructions to Timothy about these. The first danger, and we'll again get into what he says about it, was persecution. And there had been persecution from the Jews. The Jews were angry at them, but that were not really affecting so much the church in Ephesus, because Ephesus was in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, what we call Turkey today. But there was persecution from the Roman Empire, and especially under Nero, because Nero was trying to destroy, and obviously we know, since we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, it was Satan trying to destroy the church, but he was using the governmental leaders to do that. And so there was an outright persecution against the church. In fact, Fox's Book of Martyrs is written about this time when there were horrible things done to Christians. Horrible things done to Christians. So the point is, as we look at some of these references to enduring hardship, the hardship was persecution. Now, in our day and age, we think of persecution as leaving church and having a flat tire. Oh, the devil's after me, I had a flat tire. Or maybe trouble on your job, or maybe your wife didn't smile at you this morning, or your eggs weren't cooked right, or you couldn't get, well, we don't wear, most of us don't wear ties anymore, but you couldn't get your hair right. Oh, this is terrible. No, they were literally burning people at the stake. Families in front of each other. I don't want to go into what they were doing. The church was trying to be destroyed. But isn't it interesting? The harder the devil tried to destroy it, the more it prospered. And then the devil figured out what was wrong. This isn't working. So instead of persecuting the church in the 4th century, the devil had the church legalized under Constantine the emperor. And that accomplished making the church accepted by the society, had more destruction to the church than the persecution of the church did. The persecution of the church did two things. It separated those who were true believers from those who were only in it for what they could get out of it. And it made them stronger, because it made them go back to, why do I believe what I believe? When the church became accepted and legalized, anybody could belong, and it watered everything down. And that's where we've been in the United States. That's why the church in the United States is so weak. We may have huge churches growing in numbers, but how strong are we spiritually? And we'll begin to talk about that next week. So the first threat was the hardships that they were enduring under persecution, because under persecution, there's pressure to quit and go back. If you're tempted to do that, read Hebrews 10, because it talks about people going back. And the exhortation by the author of Hebrews is that whatever is going on, whatever pressure comes against you, hold fast to your confession. Don't let it go, because God does not take pleasure in those who turn back to destruction. We're living in an age of grace, and grace is wonderful. And as I mentioned last time, but grace is simply a parenthesis in time. There was a time before grace when God's holiness and judgment was in the earth, and there will be a time on the other side of the second parenthesis when God's judgment will come back upon the earth. And we live in this era of grace that's in between. But the purpose of this grace is to not sit back at ease. The purpose of this grace is to give us the freedom to grow and mature in our spirituality, so that when things begin to get tough and the pressure comes on, we don't cave in and fold up. But I think many of us are using this grace to put our feet up and to just relax and enjoy the ride. But there's a difference. I never thought of this before. There's a difference in a ride and a journey. A ride, somebody's carrying you somewhere, and you don't have to do anything. A journey, you got to fight your way through things. The movie, the Pilgrim's Progress that we did last year, that's all about a journey from when he got saved to the final celestial city. And we're on a journey together. So that was the first threat. The second threat was that the church was existing now in a time when moral decay in the society was getting worse. It was never good, but it's getting worse, and we're going to look at some scriptures that show that. And then the third threat against the church was that there were people coming into the church, false teachers coming into the church, leading the church astray, leading them astray. And Paul gives instructions to Timothy, the overseer of these churches, of what to do. These are his last instructions to him of what to do to take the mantle as Paul hands the mantle off to Timothy. So let's begin to look at that. Okay. This is a very personal letter. Again, there's no doctrine in this. So let's go to 1 Timothy. I'm not going to read through the whole letter. We don't have time to do that. 2 Timothy chapter 1. Let's start in verse 3. I thank my God through whom I serve with a pure conscience as my forefathers did, without ceasing, as I remember you in my prayers day and night, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with your joy. So Timothy was going through a difficult time. What we're going to see is Timothy is a young man. And with all these pressures on him of ministry, with all these pressures of the responsibility, for all these pressures that were on him because of the time they're living in, Timothy was wavering. He'd become afraid. And he was obviously crying. He was moaning or he was mourning for what they were going through. So he talks about his tears. Verse 4, I desire to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy when I recall your remembrance of your genuine faith that is in you. So what he's doing is he's calling Timothy back to his heritage. He's reminding Timothy of his heritage. And what was his heritage? Of the genuine faith that is in you. Notice how Paul believes in him. And which first dwelled in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded is in you now. Therefore, I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. So apparently, Timothy lost confidence in what God had put in him. Verse 7, well-known verse, for God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. So the fear that Timothy was wrestling with had not come from within him. It was coming from without. The spirit that God's put in us is not a spirit that has fear in it, but it's a powerful spirit. It's the spirit of the living God, and it is a spirit of love, and it's a spirit of a sound mind, not of confusion. So Paul gives him that background. He encourages him by reminding him of his faith and the heritage of his faith. Then he goes on to say in verse 8, therefore, because of that, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord. That's what the devil's trying to do, is to get us to be afraid to testify of the Lord. It's interesting, in Revelation 12, it says they overcame the devil. How? By the word of their testimony. By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their... Our words are so important. Our words are so important. Satan's after your words. He's after your words, to be words of discouragement, words of defeat, because they are all dishonoring to the God who shed his son's blood to save us and to redeem us, who's filled us with his spirit so that we have his power and his ability to do whatever God has set us to do. And the devil wants you to shrink back because he's looking at yourself and what you can't do and who you are. That's what was happening to Timothy. Timothy began to look at himself and see who he was compared to this tremendous threat that was rising up against him. And Paul's reminding him, it's not you, Timothy. Look at the faith that's been built in you. Look at the faith, and I believe in the faith that's in you and what God has put in you. And it's not a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. So don't be ashamed of the testimony of the Lord or of his prisoners. This was Paul. And share with me in the suffering of the gospel according to the power of God. So I'm going to get ahead of myself here. Okay. Slow down, Sean. Slow down. Okay. Paul is telling him to endure the suffering that he's been going through, to endure that suffering. This is not fun stuff to talk about. It's much more fun as a pastor to say, let's just talk about our victory in Christ. Let's talk about all the blessings of God that he wants to pour on us. But I have a responsibility to you and before God to tell you the truth. There are hardships coming. And the storm of it's out there right now. There are already brothers and sisters in Christ in this nation being persecuted for their faith. And I guarantee if you stand up and you declare what the Bible says about certain issues of this day, you will be persecuted. We want the blessings of God, but Jesus promised they come only with persecution. We have to decide who we're going to serve. And this is where persecution and pressure helps us make that decision. It brings us to that point of decision. And it's not fun, but I'll tell you, once you make that decision, you're free. Amen. Satan doesn't have any hold over you anymore. And we're going to talk about that as we move forward. Okay. Where are we here? Okay. So we're going to draw from these instructions because we're facing similar challenges. We're living in a culture and a society that's increasingly hostile to the gospel. These are all in my notes that are available online. And to those who would hear of it. And persecution will likely follow. We're raising, and I don't necessarily mean in church, although we are to some degree, we're raising a generation. There's a generation now that's being raised, that's raised at this point. A generation that has a belief system, a worldview and a belief system that's so contrary to what's ever been taught before. As I spent a series, I think it was last year, on postmodernism and what's been taught in our public schools and what's being taught in our universities and the philosophies of the press, the philosophies of our political system, the philosophies of the world. And it's essentially this: there is no such thing as absolute truth. Truth is whatever you decide it is for you. Isn't that handy? And the way you discern truth is how I feel. So we're raising a generation that decides what's right and wrong, what we do or don't do, by how I feel. There was a book written by Tom Brokaw, I think it was, about my parents' generation, the generation that went through World War II. And he called it the greatest generation. And if you ever saw the movie, there's several of them out there, but the latest movie, it's been out for quite a while now, of Pearl Harbor. There's a scene where they're on the Hornet, and they're headed up to Tokyo because the decision was, after the terrible disaster of Pearl Harbor, was to do an attack back on Tokyo, not so much to win the war, but for morale for the United States. And so there was this task force and it was a long story. I've read the book about it. And there's a scene at the end where the admiral's standing there talking to the captain of the ship, I think. I don't remember who they were. And he's looking at these young men. And he said, we've just had Pearl Harbor. Nothing good's happened. He said, I know we're going to win this war. He said, how do you know that? Because of men like this. Why? Because it was a generation that did not look for what am I getting out of it. It was a generation that looked at what do I have to give? What is my share? We've been attacked. I want to sign up and do something. It was a generation that was not looking for me and mine. It was not a generation that was raised to be comfortable, because it was a generation that had been raised with spankings, not timeouts. It was a generation that had been raised with discipline. Many of them had been children in the Depression, so they've been raised not having anything. And that built character and strength of character. And then my generation was raised by those that came out of the war, and the boomers. And in my generation, they tended to want to make things easier for us so that we didn't have to go through what they went through. And then my generations raised this next generation, which is now raising a generation. And with each generation, discipline, sacrifice, service has become a further and further distant ideal until it's all about me and my. And the generation that's out there in colleges now has been given the term the snowflake generation. Why? A snowflake is a beautiful, unique thing until it hits the ground and hits any kind of heat, and it melts. It has no staying power. This was driven home to me this week, especially because somebody asked me this morning about Molly. I've decided to take Molly to obedience school. It's not because she's bad. She's a very well-behaved dog. But I had taken those who went through School of Ministry had heard about Mandy. Mandy was a miniature poodle we had 30-some years ago. And I told the story of taking Mandy to obedience school and discovering that obedience school wasn't for the dog, it was for me. And I decided that I just needed some help. It'd been 30-some years since I've trained a dog, that it would be a good idea. And she's learning to sit, and she's learning to heel, and learning to do some basic things. But it would help me to make sure I've strengthened in these things. Whoa, did I have my eyes opened. The philosophy of obedience school is completely different than when I took Mandy 30-some years ago to obedience school. When I took Mandy to obedience school, the method of correction was with a choke collar. Peter people are going to write me letters. But the choke collar was the most humane thing because what it did is it just jolted her a little bit so that she knew that's not what you're supposed to do. And she was to be disciplined with no and a little jerk on the chair. And it worked perfectly. She became extremely loving, trained, disciplined, but loving, healthy dog. They don't use them anymore. They use treats. And the very first lesson was simply to get her to take a treat. Molly mastered that quickly. And I was sharing with my son Chris on Tuesday when I came in. He says, of course, they're millennial dogs. And the course is taught by a millennial. And my apologies to our millennials, but that's the reality is. And our flesh likes that. And that's what was creeping into the church. And we're going to see that Paul wrote about that. Oh my goodness, we got to move on. Okay. Paul's final instruction. So let's go look at this. All right, we started already. All right. Timothy, become fearful. Now let's go down to verse 11. He's talking about the gospel. This is what Paul has sacrificed his life for, is the gospel. To which I was appointed a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher of the Gentiles. And it's for this reason I suffer these things. Nevertheless, I'm not ashamed. Look at this. This is the first point. For I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day. Paul didn't say, I endure hardship and I'm not ashamed because, hey, I like being beaten. I like being stuck down in this hole in the ground. I like this. It feels good. No, it didn't feel good. Paul said, I've done this for the sake of the gospel because it was something that was entrusted to me, but there's a promise that's been given to me. It's at the end of the letter. There's a promise that's been given to me. So I have entrusted myself. I have entrusted my welfare. I have entrusted me to the one I know. And he is able to keep me until that day. So there's several things to see out of this. First of all, there is a day coming. We're not going to get into it, but one of his instructions in there refers to Onesimus, who served him faithfully and came to comfort him. And Paul says, may God have mercy upon him on that day. So there's a day coming of accountability to what did you do with what God gave you to do. Paul said, I was called as a preacher of the gospel. I was called as an apostle of the gospel. I was called as a teacher of the gospel. And it's for this reason, because I was a messenger of the gospel, that I'm in this situation and having to endure this hardship. But the reason I could do that is because I know whom I have believed. Not I know about him, not I believe in him, but I know him. So the first point today is, in order to be able to endure the hardship, the only thing that will help you to endure the hardship is to have a personal, intimate relationship with Jesus. And we're going to talk about that on this journey. A personal, intimate, because Paul says, I know. I don't know about him. I don't know things about him. I don't know his doctrine. It's not I believe in the principles of the church. It was a personal relationship with Jesus, and that's the only thing that held Paul through the tough things that he went through. And not just that I know him, I know something about him. Because I know him in whom I believed, and I am persuaded because I know him, that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day. What had Paul committed to him? His future, his hope, his life. So that's the first major point Paul is making here. While we're in this time of parenthesis, while we're in this time, don't waste the time that you have right now. It's time to develop, if you have not developed one, a personal, intimate relationship with Christ. And the journey we're going to start going on is designed to help lead you into a closer, intimate, personal relationship with Jesus.